through those thunderstorms this morning okay. Had a good long weekend. We are nearing the end of chapter 7, so I want you to keep in mind that our next unit test is going to just be chapter 7 and chapter 8. So we're nearing the end of chapter 7. We're not going to spend too much time on chapter 8. And so in effect, we're nearing the end of the material for the semester. So keep that in mind. Today, we're going to talk first. I'll show you what assignments you have for the week on Canvas, and then we will finish up our discussion of the peripheral nervous system. On Wednesday, we'll do a short lecture about neurological diseases, and then you'll spend the rest of the time working on a case study that I posted to Canvas already. And then on Friday, we'll start chapter 8. So, again, if there are questions at any point, please put them in the chat feature. Please make sure you mute your microphone. I think I got that one. Okay. So let me here. Okay, so this is your Canvas page again. The things you got to pay attention to for this week. So you've got homework 5. The first thing coming up is homework 5. It's due on Wednesday, April 15th, and like all of the homeworks that we had when we were in class, it's due at the beginning of what would be our class time. So for your section, that is 10:10 a.m. Homework 5 is due. And keep in mind, it's like the same format as the other homeworks. It's 20 multiple choice questions and then 2 short answer questions. Okay. This is the case study I talked about. I've designed it so that you'll spend what would have been the rest of class time Wednesday working on it, but you are free to work on it now. When you go to the case study, you'll see that it is a short PDF about brains, about monkey brains in particular. And I want you to write your answers and type them up and then submit that file. So you're going to type up your responses. If you don't have, the case study is locked. Okay. I will take a look at that when I'm done. I believe I designed it so that you do it on Wednesday. And that was the timing for it. But I wanted to just go over before we got there. I will take a look at that specifically. Okay. The other thing I want you to see, sorry, going back to the assignment page, is that you have your last worksheet for chapter 7 is due next week, so we can work on that. We'll talk about the cranial nerves today, so at the end of today's lecture, you'll have all the information you need to know for that worksheet. And then the final thing is 2 discussion posts for this week. So if you go under discussions, you have a new things you found interesting or confusing, and then you've got the last of the nervous system questions. And these questions, the first one is about the peripheral nervous system, and we'll cover that today. And the last 2 we cover on Wednesday. Okay. Are there any questions people have about the material that's due this week? Okay. So I'm going to jump to the PowerPoint. Make sure I saw the chat window open. Okay. So where we had left off. We finished the discussion of the central nervous system. We talked all about different parts of our brain. We talked about the spinal cord. We broke down what's in the spinal cord. And now we're looking at the peripheral nervous system. So keep in mind the central nervous system is our brain and spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system, all of the nerves that come out of the central nervous system and fill our body and allow us to move and interact with our environment and sense things and all of the functions associated with our peripheral nervous system. So we'll start by talking about our cranial nerves. So your cranial nerves serve mainly your head and your neck. These are nerves that come out of your brain. So there are 12 pairs of them. And the vagus nerve is the only nerve that serves your thoracic and your abdominal cavity. So it's the only nerve that doesn't serve your head and neck region. And what I want you to know for the cranial nerves is I want you to first know their name. So if I say cranial nerve 1, I want you to be able to tell me that it's the olfactory nerve. I also want you to know what they do. So you're the name and then the function, number 2. So for olfactory, cranial nerve 1, it's responsible for our sense of smell, for transmitting smell information to the brain. And then I want you to know whether we would classify that as a sensory nerve, a motor nerve, or both a sensory and motor nerve. So again, for olfactory, it's purely sensory. So if I say, tell me about cranial nerve 1, you would say, oh, it's the olfactory nerve. It's responsible for the sense of smell, and it's a pure sensory nerve, okay? So we're going to briefly go through all 12 of our cranial nerves, but those are the pieces of information that I want you to know about your cranial nerves. So what their name is, what their function is, and whether they are sensory, motor, or both. And most of them are both. It's the major category, but there are some exceptions to that. This is showing you where the nerves come from, what parts of the brain they come from, and where they go. So again, that'll give you some information about the function. Some of the names also tell you about the function. So for example, optic, you can guess from the name that it has to do with vision, but others are a little bit more confusing or not quite as clear just from the name. So they're going to take a little bit of memorization to get that function component. Okay. This is where in class you would fill out the cranial nerve chart. That is instead a homework assignment. Okay, so if we go through, this is the chart that you're going to be filling out. The first one is olfactory. This comes from the olfactory receptors in our nose, and it goes all the way back to your olfactory bulb, which will in turn send fibers back to your olfactory cortex. And this is, again, a purely sensory fiber, so it only has the sense of smell. It doesn't have motor, so it's not responsible for moving anything inside your nose, just for smelling things. 2 is optic. Optic is from the retina, so the fibers in the retina will form your optic nerve, and we'll talk about both of these cranial nerves more in depth in chapter 8 when we go into our senses. This sends the fibers back to our optic cortex, and again, these are also purely sensory. So cranial nerve 2, also purely sensory, purely about the sense of vision. 3s are ocular motor. These run from your midbrain to your eye. And these allow you to move your eye. So they are responsible for 4 out of the 6 muscles that allow you to move your eye. Move your eye, it's actually pretty complicated. There are all sorts of small muscles that I didn't make you know that help you move your eye in different directions. And so cranial nerve 3 is responsible for innervating 4 out of the 6 muscles that move your eye. It also directs your eyelid, and it's responsible for the internal muscles that control things like lens and pupil size. And we'll talk more about the lens and the pupil and how we see in that vision apparatus starting with chapter 8. Okay. 4 is our trochlear nerve. These also go to the eye, and these just do one of the other muscles that move our eye. So when you have someone or when you're looking at someone and they're moving their eye around, they're using a few different cranial nerves together. So cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 4 are responsible for the movement of the eye. Okay. Cranial nerve 5 is our trigeminal nerve. This comes from the pons. We talked about the pons before. And this runs into your face and carries sensory impulses from the skin of your face and the mucosa of your mouth, and also the motor responsible for chewing. So your trigeminal helps you chew. 6 is our abducens muscle, or nerve. This comes from our pons and runs to our eye. This is the last one that helps move your eye around. So going back, we have 3, 4, and 6 all working together to help you move your eye. So again, vision, very important, very complicated. We'll talk more about the active vision in chapter 8. Okay. Cranial nerve 7 is our facial nerve. Leaves pons, goes to our face, helps you make all sorts of facial expressions. If you moving your face around, you're using cranial nerve 7 to do that. This also is responsible for your salivary gland, so building the saliva in your mouth, and it carries the sensory impulses from the anterior part of your tongue, which has taste buds, and we'll talk about taste in chapter 8 as well. Cranial nerve 8 is our vestibular cochlear nerve. This is responsible for going from your inner ear to your brainstem, and this is going to give you both hearing and balance. As we talk about in chapter 8, when we talk about our inner ear, your inner ear has structures responsible both for hearing and for balance. And so both of that sensory information is going to travel on cranial nerve 8, both hearing and balance. Cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal. So this comes from our medulla to our throat and supplies the motor fibers for your throat and promotes swallowing, also helps with saliva production. And this also gives sensory impulses to the posterior tongue. So cranial nerve 9, swallowing, posterior tongue. Okay. An interesting one is cranial nerve 10. This is our vagus nerve. This is the only one that's going to send fibers down to the thoracic and abdominal cavities. So this is a nerve that's associated with our parasympathetic nervous system, which we'll talk about at the end of class today. And this helps with promoting digestion and slowing down your heart rate. So vagus nerve stimulation is going to promote a rest and digest kind of mentality and homeostasis in the body. And when people talk about overstimulation of the vagus nerve as a counterbalance to the sympathetic nervous system. As we'll discuss in a little bit, the sympathetic nervous system, this is your fight or flight response. So you're going to bring up your heart rate, you're going to get your body ready for fighting. And the parasympathetic is opposed to that. Well, if you see something really scary, you're going to have a quick and immediate sympathetic response. Like bear jumps out, oh my gosh, sympathetic response through the roof. If you subsequently pass out, that is an overstimulation of the vagus nerve. So your body is trying to bring yourself back into balance a little bit, and the vagus nerve will cause you to pass out if it's overstimulated. Happens to me sometimes with scary things, like maybe not a bear, but giant needles, for example. Cranial nerve 11, that is our accessory nerve. This is going to come from the superior part of your spinal cord, and this is going to travel to the muscles of your neck specifically. So your sternocleidomastoid and your trapezius muscles are innervated by cranial nerve 11. And then finally, we have cranial nerve 12, or hypoglossal. This is the motor fibers for moving your tongue around, as well as more sensory fibers from your tongue. So cranial nerve 12, all about the tongue. Okay. So if you're watching this video after class time, pause it and try and think of a mnemonic on your own. If you're watching it live, we're going to take a few seconds. Try to think of a mnemonic to help you remember your cranial nerves. Again, you have to know the name of each cranial nerve and what it does and what kind of fibers. Take a second, think to yourself. Mnemonics, putting all those letters together. So for this one, you want to make sure you keep the letters in order so that the order gives you some information. Okay, so this is what I was taught for the names. On old Olympus's towering top, a Finn and German viewed some hops. So the first letter of each of those words are going to give you the first letter of each of your 12 cranial nerves. The second mnemonic is to help you remember if it is a sensory fiber, S, a motor fiber, M, or if it has both, B. So some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. So this is going to give you whether it's sensory, motor, or both, which are things you need to know for your cranial nerves. Okay. So moving from the cranial nerves down, we're going to talk about our spinal nerves. So your cranial nerves mainly responsible for the head and the neck, with the exception of the vagus nerve. And then your spinal nerves innervate your body. So you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And again, they're named for the region of the spine that they arise from. So they are named based on the same names as the vertebrae. So you have to know the names of the vertebrae in order to know the names of your spinal nerves. And these divide into dorsal and ventral components that have both motor and sensory. So while your cranial nerves, some had both motor and sensory, for your spinal nerves, all of them have motor and sensory together. And they form these plexuses, which are complex networks that are going to be in your body. The dorsal ones are, again, for the posterior part of your body, and the ventral plexuses are going to be for the front part of your body. And again, this picture is showing you that they're named for the area of your spine that they arise from. So you have cervical nerves, thoracic nerves, lumbar nerves, and sacral nerves. And most of them form large plexuses, specifically ventral plexuses, to the front part of your body. You don't need to know the rami and the plexuses here for your spinal nerves. I just want you to know that they're named for the region that they arise from and that you have 31 pairs. Okay. Let's now talk about the motor branch of your peripheral nervous system. So if you remember from that chart, at the very beginning of the chapter where we talked about the nervous system and how it's organized, we talked about how we have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves of your body. And the first branch is the sensory branch, that's the afferent branch. That's all the information that comes and approaches the spinal cord in the brain. And then we have the efferent branch, which is our motor branch. And these are the things that are going to be leaving the brain and the spinal cord and filling the body. So you can further divide the motor branch, remember, into somatic and autonomic. Somatic being things under voluntary control, and autonomic being things under involuntary control. The autonomic nervous system is in the motor branch of the peripheral nervous system, and it's what happens to your body automatically. So you want to think about the two muscle tissue types that are under involuntary control, our cardiac muscle and our smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle, again, found just in the heart, helps pump blood. Smooth muscle is found around our hollow organs in our body. So your autonomic nervous system turns on the involuntary muscles, your cardiac and your smooth muscles, and it also turns on your glands. And this is going to be important when we consider homeostasis. So you have two branches of the autonomic nervous system that both work to balance each other out, to keep you at an appropriate level of activity for each of the targets. So whether that's the heart or the lungs, they're going to work together to maintain the balance of activity versus relaxing. So your somatic system, again, this is the voluntary motor system. The cell bodies here are in the central nervous system, and they terminate, their target is on a skeletal muscle. And this is what we talked about when we talked about how muscles contract. We talked about motor neurons releasing acetylcholine, causing that contraction. That is our somatic system, our somatic nervous system. One motor neuron terminating on a skeletal muscle using acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. The autonomic nervous system is a little bit more complicated. So in our autonomic nervous system, we're going to use a chain of two motor neurons. And the first one we call our preganglionic neuron, and the second one we call our postganglionic neuron. Preganglionic one starts in the central nervous system, but synapses on that postganglionic neuron outside of our central nervous system, specifically outside of the spinal cord. The postganglionic neuron is then going to terminate on our target organ, whether it's the heart, the liver, the lungs, etc. And they, again, can come in two different flavors, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. When you think sympathetic, I want you to think fight or flight. When you think parasympathetic, I want you to think rest and digest. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's a situation that you would see and your immediate response would be to either run or attack. You want to think, what do I do if I see a giant bear? That's your sympathetic nervous system. It's getting you ready for that stressful situation. Your parasympathetic, on the other hand, is cooling things down. It's helping you digest your food, rest. You want to think, after Thanksgiving dinner, what is my body doing? That's going to be your parasympathetic system. While your somatic nervous system just uses acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter, your autonomic nervous system uses three neurotransmitters. It's going to use acetylcholine, but it's also going to use norepinephrine and epinephrine. And we abbreviate norepinephrine as NE, and epinephrine, I abbreviate it as EPI, epi. You probably have heard of epinephrine in regards to EpiPens or those epinephrine auto-injectors that in the past few years have cost a ton of money, and there was a lot of news about that. Epinephrine is given to someone who's going into anaphylactic shock following an allergic reaction, and that's because it will trigger that fight or flight, that sympathetic response, and that can help a person recover from the constriction of anaphylaxis. So epinephrine, fight or flight. Okay, so what does that look like visually? Again, somatic nervous system turns on our skeletal muscles, our voluntary motor system, with one motor neuron releasing acetylcholine onto the skeletal muscle. And that is a system we covered in depth when we talked about muscle contraction. Your autonomic nervous system, on the other hand, has two branches. It's got the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic. Sympathetic, fight or flight, parasympathetic, rest and digest. Both of them use a two-neuron chain, and their targets are going to be your involuntary muscles, your smooth muscle and your cardiac muscles, as well as glands. And whereas your somatic nervous system just uses acetylcholine, your autonomic nervous system uses three different neurotransmitters: acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Okay, so a question you might see would be asking you to compare those. That's one of the discussion questions for the last part of the nervous system. comparing the somatic and the autonomic divisions of the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. Okay. So let's focus now on the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic division and how they differ. And the first way that they differ is structurally. So the parasympathetic has nerves that come from our craniosacral division. So they come either their cranial nerves, cranial nerve 3, 7, 9, and 10, or their sacral nerves. And when you look at them structurally, the parasympathetic ones have a shorter neuron 2, a shorter postganglionic axon. The sympathetic system, however, comes from the thoracic and lumbar region, and they have a longer postganglionic axon. This is what it looks like visually. Shown in purple are your parasympathetic nerves, again coming from the cranial nerves or the sacral nerves, and in green are your sympathetic, coming from that thoracic lumbar region. The other thing you should note is that they have a lot of the same targets. So they're going to be working to maintain homeostasis depending on the environment for things like your heart rate, for your lungs, for your stomach. They're going to be helping to maintain that correct level of activity for whatever circumstance you're in. What you should also notice is that there are certain ones that are only found in the sympathetic. So the sympathetic has a few extra targets, things like the skin, and a few others that we'll talk about are just coming from the sympathetic system. Okay. So what do they do? So the first part we talked about was the structure. Now let's tie it to that function. Sympathetic is your fight or flight response. So in general, it's going to prepare your body to handle a stressful situation. It's going to do things like increase your cardiac output, increase your respiration, bring blood to your skeletal muscles, and it's going to turn down the processes that are not going to be useful when you're in a stress situation. It's going to turn down things like digestion, for example. And your parasympathetic system opposes this. It works in opposite. So parasympathetic input is going to help you slow your heart rate down, increase digestion. Your parasympathetic also can make you feel kind of tired and sleepy. This is that post-Thanksgiving meal situation. You're just eating a lot. You need parasympathetic input to increase the digestion of all that food. It's going to make you tired, okay? That's what the parasympathetic system does. So if you're looking at a giant list, you want to try and think of yourself in those two situations. Sympathetic, facing a giant bear. Parasympathetic, just ate a really big meal. And what would your body do? So which one would be responsible, for example, for increasing heart rate, increasing the urge to urinate, increasing the saliva in your mouth, increasing your blood sugar, dilating your bronchioles and your blood vessels, stimulating your sweat glands, constricting your pupils? Most of it is intuitive when you think about those two situations. Facing a bear, eating a big meal. Sympathetic, parasympathetic. Okay, if it's not, here's a giant table that breaks it all down for you even more. So again, parasympathetic, rest and digest, post-Thanksgiving. We're going to do things like increase the mobility of our digestive system. We're going to turn down things like increasing oxygen, so we're going to constrict or make smaller our bronchioles in our lungs, decrease our heart rate, okay? Increase the amount of saliva, tears, gastric juices. And the sympathetic is going to have the opposite effect. It's going to turn down the things that your body doesn't need to waste time on when you're facing a giant bear. It's going to turn down the digestive system. It's going to inhibit the saliva production. It's going to increase your heart rate, dilate your bronchioles so you bring more oxygen into your lungs. The other thing I want you to notice is that there are certain things that only have sympathetic effects and don't have parasympathetic. For example, the parasympathetic system does nothing to your liver, but the sympathetic system will tell your liver to release glucose and increase your blood glucose levels. This is because, again, you're facing a giant bear. You're going to need a lot of energy. So your liver stores extra glucose in it, and you're going to tell the liver, release it. I need that energy to help me, okay? Things like the kidneys, no parasympathetic effect, but the sympathetic is going to say, now is not the time for peeing. Decrease that urine output. Okay. Moving on to more organs. Effects on the pupil. The parasympathetic is going to constrict the pupil. The sympathetic is going to dilate the pupil. This changes the amount of light you bring in, as we'll talk about when we talk about vision. So dilating the pupil, making it bigger, is going to increase the amount of light, which is going to help you in a stressful situation take in more visual information. No effect again for the parasympathetic on a lot of different things. So the parasympathetic has no effect on your adrenal glands, no effect on your sweat glands, no effect on overall metabolism or adipose tissue. Whereas the sympathetic is going to do things to all of those organs to prepare you for a stressful situation. It's going to help you release hormones. It's going to make you sweat, give you goosebumps, stimulate your fat breakdown, increase your general metabolic rate. Okay, so all of those things you want to think again. What would I do when I face a bear? That's a sympathetic response. What would I do after Thanksgiving? That's a parasympathetic response. Okay. With that, we have reached the end of our peripheral nervous system. So far we have covered central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. We're going to finish by talking about some disorders, not a ton of disorders, just a few key disorders, and then we'll be done with chapter 7. So, are there any, I'm going to stop recording. Are there any questions that people